Picture this: you're standing on the surface of Mars. The rust-colored dust beneath your boots stretches endlessly toward a salmon-pink sky. You take a breath through your helmet, knowing that without it, you'd be dead in seconds. But what if that didn't have to be the case? What if centuries from now, humans could walk barefoot across Martian plains? Here is a question for you. If you could change one thing about Mars to make it habitable, what would you choose first? Comment down below. I'll pin the most creative answer. Now let's begin. Mars has haunted humanity's imagination for millennia. Ancient civilizations saw it as a wandering red star, a celestial mystery moving against the fixed backdrop of the cosmos. Today, we know Mars as our planetary neighbor, a frozen desert world that once, billions of years ago, might have been remarkably similar to Earth. The Perseverance rover, which touched down in Jezero crater in February of 2021, has sent back evidence that this crater once held an open lake system over 3.5 billion years ago. Think about that for a moment. While Earth was still a young world covered in oceans, Mars had lakes, rivers, and perhaps conditions suitable for life. But something catastrophic happened. Mars lost its magnetic field, and without that protective shield, solar wind slowly stripped away its atmosphere. The water that once flowed across its surface either escaped into space or froze into the ground. Today, Mars is a world of extremes. With an average surface temperature of -55 degrees Celsius, plunging as low as -125 degrees during its fierce dust storms. Its atmospheric pressure is less than 1% of Earth's, so thin that liquid water simply cannot exist in a stable state on the surface. If you poured a glass of water on Mars today, it would either instantly boil away or freeze solid, depending on the temperature. Yet despite these harsh realities, Mars remains our best candidate for becoming humanity's second home. It has a day that's remarkably similar to Earth's, 24 hours and 39 minutes. It has seasons, polar ice caps, and geological features that tell stories of a dynamic past. Most importantly, Mars has resources, water ice locked beneath its surface and in its polar caps, carbon dioxide in its thin atmosphere, and minerals in its soil. The question isn't whether Mars could theoretically support human life. The question is whether we have the capability, the will, and the wisdom to transform it. Terraforming, the process of deliberately modifying a planet's environment to make it habitable for Earth life, represents perhaps the most ambitious engineering project humanity could ever attempt. We're not talking about building a city or even a continent. We're talking about re-engineering an entire planet, manipulating planetary scale systems that took billions of years to evolve naturally. It's a concept that pushes against the very boundaries of what we consider possible. Please subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. Your support helps me continue creating content that explores the deepest mysteries of our cosmos. Now, the first thing to understand about terraforming Mars is the sheer scale of what we're attempting. Recent research published in 2026 from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory has provided us with sobering calculations about what planetary engineering actually requires. To create an atmosphere thick enough for humans to walk around without pressure suits, though still needing oxygen masks, we'd need to add approximately 20 to 100 millibars of pressure to Mars's current 6 millibar atmosphere. That might not sound like much, but here's where the cosmic mathematics becomes staggering. Mars requires 3.89 times 10 to the 15th power kilograms of atmospheric material for every single millibar of pressure we want to add. Let me put that in perspective. To reach just 20 millibars, still far below the Armstrong limit, where human blood boils, we'd need to add roughly 78 times 10 to the 15th power kilograms of gas to Mars's atmosphere. That's 78,000 trillion kilograms. To reach breathable atmospheric pressure, similar to Earth's at 1,000 millibars, We're talking about Exaton-class inventories. That's 10 to the 17th or 10 to the 18th power kilograms. An exaton is 1 quintillion kilograms. These numbers are so vast they become almost abstract, but they represent real mass that would need to be sourced, processed, and distributed across an entire planet. And this brings us to our first major challenge. Where would all this atmospheric material come from? Mars itself has some resources. The planet's polar ice caps contain both water ice and frozen carbon dioxide, dry ice. There's also carbon dioxide trapped in the Martian regolith, the layer of dust and broken rock covering the surface. Early proposals for warming Mars suggested simply releasing these carbon dioxide reserves. Carl Sagan, the legendary astronomer who first popularized the idea of terraforming Mars back in 1973, envisioned melting the polar caps to release carbon dioxide and create a runaway greenhouse effect. But here's where modern science delivers a reality check. Recent analysis of Mars's carbon dioxide inventory, based on data from multiple orbiters, landers, and rovers including the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and the MAVEN spacecraft, suggests that accessible carbon dioxide on Mars could provide at most around 20 to 40 millibars of additional atmospheric pressure. That would warm the planet by less than 10 degrees Celsius. Not enough, not nearly enough. We need to raise Mars's average temperature by at least 50 to 60 degrees to reach the freezing point of water, and ideally 70 to 80 degrees to have regions where liquid water could exist year-round. This revelation fundamentally changed how scientists think about terraforming Mars. We can't simply wake up Mars' dormant atmosphere because there isn't enough of it left to wake up. The solar wind stripped most of it away over billions of years. This means any serious terraforming attempt would require either importing massive quantities of atmospheric gases from space, perhaps from the outer solar system's ice moons, or manufacturing them through industrial processes on Mars itself. Both options present engineering challenges that dwarf anything humanity has ever attempted. So if Mars doesn't have enough carbon dioxide to terraform itself, what are our options? This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because scientists have been exploring multiple pathways, each with its own promises and problems. Let's explore these possibilities one by one, grounding ourselves in the latest research from 2025 and 2026. The first approach involves what scientists call super greenhouse gases, artificially manufactured compounds that trap heat far more effectively than carbon dioxide. On Earth, we're familiar with greenhouse gases like methane and carbon dioxide that trap infrared radiation, keeping our planet warm enough for liquid water. But there are synthetic molecules, particularly fluorinated compounds like sulfur hexafluoride or perfluorocarbons, that can trap heat thousands of times more effectively than carbon dioxide, molecule for molecule. Here's where the math becomes interesting. According to research published in March of 2026, if we could manufacture and release engineered aerosols or nanoparticles into Mars's atmosphere, we might be able to create significant warming with far less mass than trying to thicken the atmosphere with carbon dioxide alone. These particles would need to be designed with specific properties. They must absorb infrared radiation efficiently, remain suspended in the atmosphere for long periods, and be resistant to photochemical breakdown by ultraviolet light from the sun. A groundbreaking paper from 2026 modeled the effects of injecting engineered aerosols into Mars's atmosphere. The researchers found that achieving global warming of approximately 35 degrees Celsius might be possible with continuous aerosol release. Think about what that means. We could potentially raise Mars's temperature from its current frigid negative 55 degrees to around negative 20 degrees Celsius. That's still below freezing, but it's a temperature where some Earth organisms can survive, where certain chemical processes become feasible and where subsurface ice might begin to melt. But, and this is crucial, the study also revealed significant complications. Every 20 degrees of warming would cause a tenfold increase in atmospheric water vapor as sublimation of ice from the North Polar Cap accelerates. This creates feedback loops. More water vapor means more clouds, and Martian clouds have complex effects. They cause nighttime warming of 5 to 10 degrees at low latitudes by trapping heat, but they also cause daytime cooling of up to 40 degrees in winter mid-latitudes by reflecting sunlight. The climate system of a warming Mars would be dynamically unstable, with weather patterns we can barely predict. And speaking of what life on a transformed Mars might actually look like, I've created an entire video exploring the daily realities of Martian existence, the challenges, the adaptations, the strange beauty of living on another world. If you're curious about what living on Mars would really be like, check out that video after this one. The link will be in the description, and it complements this discussion perfectly by grounding these planetary engineering concepts in human experience. Now let's talk about another approach, orbital mirrors. Instead of trying to warm Mars by changing its atmosphere, what if we simply gave it more sunlight? Mars receives only about 43% of the solar energy that Earth does because it's roughly 1.5 times farther from the Sun. If we could place enormous mirrors in orbit around Mars, reflecting additional sunlight onto the surface, we could warm specific regions without needing to modify the atmosphere first. This isn't as far-fetched as it might sound. We already deploy large reflective surfaces in space, solar sails for spacecraft propulsion, for example, but the scale required for meaningful Martian warming is staggering. To provide sufficient forcing to warm Mars by 50 to 70 degrees Celsius, we'd need mirrors with a combined surface area of approximately 10 to the 13th to 10 to the 14th square meters. That's 10 trillion to 100 trillion square meters of reflective material. To put it in perspective, that's roughly the size of Europe, or larger, worth of mirrors floating in space. These mirrors would need to be positioned carefully, perhaps at Mars' Lagrange points, where gravitational forces balance, allowing them to maintain stable positions relative to the planet. They'd need to be extremely lightweight yet durable enough to withstand micrometeorite impacts and the degrading effects of solar radiation over decades or centuries. They'd require precise orientation systems, continuous monitoring, and periodic replacement as they degrade. The logistics of manufacturing, launching, deploying, and maintaining such a system would require an industrial infrastructure in space that doesn't exist yet and wouldn't exist for decades, possibly centuries. Recent analysis from researchers at the California Institute of Technology calculated the industrial throughput required for various terraforming approaches. Their findings are sobering. To build breathable, oxygen-rich atmosphere on Mars would require sustained industrial output of 10 to the 7th to 10 to the 8th kilograms per second. That's 10 million to 100 million kilograms every single second, maintained continuously for centuries to millennia. The energy requirements range from hundreds of terawatts to petawatts. For context, all of human civilization currently uses about 18 terawatts of power. We're talking about energy production exceeding everything humanity currently does, dedicated solely to transforming Mars, sustained for longer than recorded human history. There's another option that's recently gained scientific attention: regional terraforming, sometimes called paraterraforming. Instead of trying to warm the entire planet, what if we started smaller? What if we created localized habitable zones, domed regions or valleys covered with advanced greenhouse materials that trap heat and allow pressure to build within enclosed spaces? Research from 2026 explored the feasibility of using silica aerogel, an incredibly lightweight material that's 99% air. As a solid-state greenhouse, aerogel is translucent, allowing visible light through while blocking infrared radiation from escaping. A layer of aerogel just 2 to 3 centimeters thick, placed over Martian regolith, could warm the ground beneath it above the melting point of water ice. This approach has several advantages. It's technologically achievable with current and or near-future materials. It could be deployed incrementally, starting with small areas around human bases. And it doesn't require modifying Mars's global atmosphere. Imagine valleys or crater floors covered with aerogel panels, creating warm pockets where subsurface ice melts into liquid water, where genetically engineered plants might grow in Martian soil, where atmospheric pressure naturally increases within the enclosed space. These wouldn't be fully breathable environments. You'd still need oxygen masks, but they'd be shirt sleeve environments where humans could walk around without full pressure suits. It's a stepping stone approach, proving concepts and building infrastructure while we develop the capabilities for larger scale interventions. The Hellas Basin, the deepest impact crater on Mars, plunging approximately 7 kilometers below the surrounding terrain, is frequently mentioned as an ideal candidate for regional terraforming. At the bottom of Hellas, atmospheric pressure is already higher than elsewhere on Mars because there's more atmosphere above pressing down. It's also one of the warmest locations on the planet. Cover portions of Hellas with greenhouse materials, warm it further with localized mirrors or aerosol release, and you might create a region where hardy Earth organisms could survive outdoors, lichens, mosses, perhaps specially engineered microbes designed to slowly build up oxygen while binding Martian soil. But here's something that keeps me awake at night, staring up at the stars. Even with all these approaches, super greenhouse gases, orbital mirrors, regional greenhouses, we're still talking about timescales that exceed human lifetimes. We're talking about projects that would require sustained commitment across multiple generations. The people who begin terraforming Mars would never see the finished result. Their great-great-great-grandchildren might not see it. This would be the ultimate long-term investment in humanity's future, demanding a kind of intergenerational cooperation and vision that we've rarely demonstrated in our history. Let's talk about something that might sound simple, but represents one of the most complex challenges in planetary engineering: creating an atmosphere humans can actually breathe. Because here's the thing, even if we warm Mars, even if we increase atmospheric pressure, we still haven't solved the fundamental problem that Mars's atmosphere is 95% carbon dioxide. You can't breathe carbon dioxide. In fact, at concentrations above 10%, it becomes toxic to humans, causing headaches, dizziness, and eventually unconsciousness and death. So warming Mars is only step one. Step two involves one of the most audacious chemical transformations ever conceived: converting a carbon dioxide atmosphere into an oxygen-nitrogen mixture similar to Earth's. This process, atmospheric oxygenation, would require fundamentally restructuring the chemical composition of an entire planetary atmosphere. Let's explore what that actually means. On Earth, our oxygen-rich atmosphere wasn't created by geological processes. It was created by life. Approximately 2.4 billion years ago, during an event called the Great Oxidation Event, photosynthetic bacteria, primarily cyanobacteria, began producing oxygen as a waste product. Over hundreds of millions of years, these microscopic organisms pumped so much oxygen into Earth's atmosphere that they completely transformed our planet's chemistry. Before cyanobacteria, Earth's atmosphere was mostly nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane. After them, we had an atmosphere that could support complex aerobic life, life that breathes oxygen. Could we do something similar on Mars, but intentionally and much faster? This is where biotechnology meets planetary science in spectacular fashion. Scientists have been exploring the possibility of engineering photosynthetic organisms, bacteria, algae, or even specially designed plants that could survive in Martian conditions and slowly convert atmospheric carbon dioxide into oxygen. But the challenges are immense. First, there's the radiation problem. Mars has no magnetic field and almost no ozone layer, meaning the surface is bombarded by ultraviolet radiation from the sun and charged particles from cosmic rays. Radiation levels on Mars are approximately 2.5 millisieverts per day. That's roughly the same as getting 8 chest X-rays every single day. Most Earth organisms would be sterilized by this radiation within hours or days. Any photosynthetic organisms we deploy on Mars would need to be either incredibly radiation resistant, perhaps engineered with DNA repair mechanisms borrowed from extremophiles like Deinococcus radiodurans, a bacterium that can survive radiation doses 1,000 times lethal to humans, or they'd need to be protected somehow, perhaps growing beneath translucent regolith or aerogel shields. Second, there's the temperature problem. Even in a warmed Mars scenario, temperatures would still regularly drop below freezing. Photosynthesis essentially stops below around 5 degrees Celsius for most plants. We'd need organisms engineered to photosynthesize at temperatures where normal plants would be frozen solid. Researchers have been studying Antarctic mosses and Arctic lichens that can photosynthesize at temperatures as low as -15 degrees Celsius, and genes from these extremophiles might be incorporated into Martian organisms. Third, and perhaps most daunting, is the sheer scale of oxygen production required. Recent calculations from 2026 research provide stunning numbers. To create a breathable atmosphere on Mars with partial oxygen pressure similar to Earth's, approximately 21% oxygen at 1,000 millibars total pressure, giving roughly 210 millibars of oxygen partial pressure, would require producing approximately 3.89 times 10 to the 17th kilograms of oxygen gas. That's 389,000 trillion kilograms of oxygen. Where does that oxygen come from? The primary source would be splitting carbon dioxide molecules, taking CO2 and breaking it apart into carbon and oxygen. But here's the energy problem. Breaking molecular bonds requires energy. Splitting one molecule of carbon dioxide into carbon and oxygen requires approximately 394 kilojoules per mole of energy. To produce enough oxygen for a breathable Martian atmosphere would require a minimum of approximately 10 to the 25th joules of energy. That's 10 trillion joules, more energy than all of human civilization has used in our entire existence up to now. Now, photosynthetic organisms do this splitting naturally using sunlight, which is why biological oxygenation is so appealing. But even with billions of photosynthetic organisms covering significant portions of Mars, the process would be incredibly slow. On Earth, it took cyanobacteria hundreds of millions of years to oxygenate our atmosphere, and they had much more favorable conditions, more sunlight per unit area, liquid water oceans providing stable environments, and no toxic perchlorates in the soil killing them. Speaking of perchlorates, this is a nasty problem that Martian explorers have discovered. The Martian regolith contains significant concentrations of perchlorate salts, chemical compounds containing chlorine and oxygen. These perchlorates are toxic to most Earth life, interfering with thyroid function and damaging cellular processes. Any organisms we introduce to Mars would need to either tolerate perchlorates or we'd need to remediate vast areas of Martian soil, removing or chemically neutralizing these compounds before life could take hold. Some researchers have suggested that certain bacteria could actually metabolize perchlorates, using them as energy sources while detoxifying the soil, a process called bioremediation. It's elegant in theory, turning a problem into a solution, but it's never been tested at planetary scales. Let's imagine, for a moment, that we've solved all these problems. We've warmed Mars, we've increased atmospheric pressure, we've deployed billions upon billions of engineered organisms that are slowly, methodically converting carbon dioxide into oxygen. What happens next? This is where Mars becomes a genuinely alien environment, a transitional world, neither the frozen desert it is now, nor the Earth-like paradise some imagine, but something entirely unique. During this transition phase, Mars would have what scientists call a reducing atmosphere in some regions and an oxidizing atmosphere in others. In areas where photosynthetic organisms are thriving, oxygen concentrations would gradually rise. But oxygen is reactive. It would start oxidizing minerals in the Martian surface, essentially rusting the planet even more than it already is. This would consume some of the oxygen being produced, acting as a chemical sink that needs to be filled before atmospheric oxygen can accumulate. On Earth, it took hundreds of millions of years after oxygen production began before oxygen started accumulating in the atmosphere at significant levels, because it was all being consumed by reactions with surface minerals and dissolved iron in the oceans. Mars would also develop an ozone layer, but slowly and unevenly. Ozone forms when ultraviolet light splits oxygen molecules, creating highly reactive oxygen atoms that recombine with other oxygen molecules to form O3s. Ozone. An ozone layer is crucial because it blocks harmful ultraviolet radiation, creating a protective shield that makes the surface safer for complex life. But ozone formation requires significant atmospheric oxygen, typically above 1%, and it takes time to build up. During the transition, Mars would have regions with some UV protection and regions with almost none, creating complex ecological zones with wildly different radiation environments. The water cycle on Mars during terraforming would be spectacular and strange. As temperatures rise, the massive quantities of water ice locked in Mars's polar caps and subsurface reservoirs would begin sublimating and melting. Research from March 2026 modeled what happens when Mars warms by 35 degrees Celsius. They found that water vapor content in the atmosphere increases tenfold for every 20 degrees of warming due to sublimation from the North Polar Cap. This water vapor would create clouds, vast cloud systems unlike anything on present-day Mars. These Martian clouds would have profound effects on the climate. Water vapor is itself a greenhouse gas, so more water vapor means more warming, a positive feedback loop. But clouds reflect sunlight, causing cooling, a negative feedback loop. The balance between these effects would depend on cloud altitude, particle size, ice crystal versus liquid droplet composition, and a dozen other factors that climate scientists are still trying to model accurately. Some simulations suggest that cloudy, warming Mars might experience nighttime temperatures 5 to 10 degrees warmer than expected at low latitudes, but daytime temperatures up to 40 degrees cooler in winter mid-latitudes. The climate would be chaotic, unpredictable, with weather patterns having no Earth analog. And then there's the question of liquid water. When would Mars have rivers again? When would lakes fill the ancient basins that once held water billions of years ago? The answer depends critically on atmospheric pressure and temperature. Water can only exist as a stable liquid within a specific range, above 0 degrees Celsius at sufficient pressure. At Mars's current pressure of 6 millibars, water cannot exist as a liquid at any temperature. It either sublimates directly from ice to vapor or briefly forms unstable liquid that immediately boils away. At around 611 pascals, roughly 6 millibars, water reaches what's called the triple point, where ice, liquid water, and water vapor can all coexist simultaneously. It's a narrow boundary, a tightrope that water walks between states of matter. To have stable liquid water on Mars, we need atmospheric pressure above this threshold, ideally significantly above. Most scientists suggest we'd need at least 50 to 100 millibars of pressure and temperatures regularly above freezing for liquid water to persist on the surface. Imagine the first Martian spring, centuries into a terraforming project. Temperatures climbs above 0 degrees Celsius in equatorial regions. Subsurface ice, warmed by a thickening greenhouse atmosphere, begins to melt. At first, the water would appear in sheltered locations, the floors of deep craters like Hellas Basin, where atmospheric pressure is highest. Small puddles would form, then freeze again at night, then melt again the next day. Over years, these puddles would grow into ponds, then lakes. Ancient riverbeds carved billions of years ago by flowing water would see liquid water again, trickling at first, then flowing as hydrological cycles establish themselves. But here's something profound that recent research has revealed. Mars might already have liquid water right now, hidden beneath its surface. Data from NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and the European Space Agency's Mars Express has detected what appear to be subsurface lakes of liquid water several kilometers beneath the Martian South Polar ice cap. These lakes, if they exist, would be kept liquid by geothermal heat from Mars's interior and by high concentrations of dissolved salts, perchlorates again, that lower water's freezing point like antifreeze. These potential subsurface lakes raise tantalizing questions about current Martian habitability. Could microbial life exist there now, sheltered from surface radiation, feeding on chemical energy from geological processes? This brings us to one of the most important questions surrounding Mars terraforming. What if Mars already has life? Not complex life, no Martian civilizations or even Martian moss, but microscopic organisms, bacteria-like creatures that have survived in subsurface refugia for billions of years since Mars's surface became uninhabitable. The Perseverance rover has been collecting samples from Jezero crater specifically to search for biosignatures, chemical or physical evidence of past life. These samples, if successfully returned to Earth by a future sample return mission planned for the early 2030s, could revolutionize our understanding of biology and our place in the cosmos. Research published in June 2026 analyzed carbonation processes in rocks from Jezero crater, finding evidence of water-rock interactions that created conditions potentially favorable for ancient microbial life. Another study from the same month investigated serpentinization, a chemical process where water reacts with olivine-rich rocks, producing hydrogen gas that microbes can use as energy. The researchers calculated that serpentinization in Jezero could have generated enough hydrogen to support microbial populations of 10 to the 14th to 10 to the 16th cells, 100 trillion to 10 quadrillion individual organisms. If Mars ever had life, Jezero crater was an excellent place for it, but if we find evidence that Mars has or had indigenous life, terraforming becomes an ethical minefield. Do we have the right to potentially contaminate or destroy a second genesis of life, an independent origin of biology that would be one of the most important scientific discoveries in human history? Some scientists argue that if we find Martian life, even extinct Martian life, Mars should be declared off-limits for terraforming, preserved as a natural laboratory for studying alternative biochemistries and evolutionary pathways. Others argue that finding microbial life shouldn't prevent human expansion, that we can study Martian organisms while still transforming the planet, perhaps even incorporating Martian biochemistry into our terraforming ecosystems. This debate connects to something deeper, the question of planetary protection and cosmic ethics. Humanity has never before had the technological capability to fundamentally alter another world. Every other human impact, deforestation, urbanization, climate change, has occurred on our home planet. Terraforming Mars would be different. It would be a conscious decision to take a pristine wilderness, a planetary environment that has evolved over 4.5 billion years, and remake it according to human designs. That's a responsibility that weighs heavily on many scientists' minds. Let me share something that fills me with both excitement and trepidation. In April 2026, researchers published findings about recent volcanic activity on Mars, phreatomagmatic eruptions, explosive interactions between lava and water ice that occurred less than 215 million years ago. That might sound ancient, but in geological terms, it's yesterday. It means Mars has been geologically active in the relatively recent past, and it might still have residual heat in its interior. There's evidence of localized volcanic activity near Tharsis, one of Mars' great volcanic provinces, where lava flows interacted with subsurface ice, creating rootless cones, small volcanic features formed by steam explosions. Why does this matter for terraforming? Because a geologically active Mars, even mildly active, means there's heat energy we might be able to harness. Geothermal energy could power early Martian settlements and industrial facilities needed for atmospheric processing. More importantly, volcanic activity releases gases from Mars's interior, water vapor, carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, adding to the atmosphere naturally. A volcanically active Mars is easier to terraform than a completely geologically dead one. Every volcanic eruption is Mars doing some of the terraforming work for us, releasing volatiles that have been locked in the planet's interior since its formation. There's also the magnetic field problem, something we haven't addressed yet, but which represents perhaps the most fundamental challenge to long-term Martian habitability. Earth has a protective magnetic field generated by its liquid iron outer core. This field extends thousands of kilometers into space, creating a magnetosphere that deflects solar wind and cosmic radiation, protecting both our atmosphere and life on the surface. Mars once had a magnetic field too, but it shut down approximately 4 billion years ago when the planet's core cooled and solidified enough to stop generating the dynamo effect that produces magnetic fields. Without a magnetic field, Mars's atmosphere has been slowly stripped away by solar wind over billions of years. Even if we successfully terraform Mars, building a thick atmosphere through tremendous effort, wouldn't that atmosphere just be stripped away again over geological time? The answer is yes, but the timescales matter enormously. Recent modeling suggests that atmospheric stripping on Mars occurs on timescales of hundreds of millions of years. So yes, a terraformed Martian atmosphere would eventually erode, but not for so long that it becomes a practical concern for human civilization. We'd have hundreds of millions of years, plenty of time to either maintain the atmosphere through industrial processes or develop technologies to create an artificial magnetic field. And that's not as crazy as it sounds. In 2017, NASA scientists proposed positioning a powerful magnetic dipole at Mars' L1 Lagrange point, a gravitationally stable location between Mars and the Sun. This artificial magnetosphere would deflect solar wind, creating a protective bubble around Mars, much like Earth's natural magnetic field does. The required magnetic field strength would be around 1 to 2 Tesla, which is strong but achievable with superconducting magnets. This wouldn't protect the surface from cosmic rays. That still requires atmospheric shielding, but it would prevent atmospheric erosion and reduce radiation exposure significantly. Picture this: a giant magnetic shield floating in space, tethered to Mars by gravity and orbital mechanics, creating an invisible barrier against the solar wind. Behind this shield, Mars's atmosphere thickens, clouds form, and water flows. It's engineering on a scale that seems impossible, yet every component, superconducting magnets, space-based power generation, station-keeping propulsion, exists in principle or in early development. The challenge isn't that it violates physics. The challenge is marshalling the resources, expertise, and sustained commitment to actually build it Let's zoom out for a moment and remember where Mars sits in the grand cosmic story. 4.5 billion years ago, our solar system condensed from a cloud of gas and dust, the remnants of previous generations of stars that lived, fused elements in their cores, and died in supernova explosions. The iron in Mars' core, the silicon in its rocks, the oxygen in its vanished atmosphere. All of it was forged in stellar furnaces and scattered across space. Mars is made of stardust, just like Earth, just like you and me. When we talk about terraforming Mars, we're talking about rearranging stardust, taking atoms that have journeyed across billions of years and organizing them into new patterns. Patterns that might someday support life, consciousness, and wonder. Now let's confront something that often gets glossed over in popular discussions about terraforming, the staggering industrial infrastructure required to actually do this. When we talk about warming Mars, thickening its atmosphere, and creating breathable air, we're not talking about sending a few clever robots to flip some planetary switch. We're talking about building an industrial civilization on another world, one capable of processing materials at rates that would make all of Earth's current industry look modest by comparison. Let's start with the basics. Every terraforming approach, whether it's releasing super greenhouse gases, deploying orbital mirrors, or seeding the planet with photosynthetic organisms, requires manufacturing capabilities on Mars itself. You simply cannot launch everything from Earth. The energy cost of escaping Earth's gravity well is approximately 62 megajoules per kilogram. To lift just 1 million kilograms, 1,000 metric tons, to Mars from Earth would require roughly 62 terajoules of energy, equivalent to the entire annual electricity consumption of a small town. And we're talking about needing to move not thousands of tons, but potentially billions or trillions of tons of material over decades and centuries. This means Mars needs mines, refineries, factories, power plants, an entire industrial base built from Martian resources. Recent research into in-situ resource utilization provides a roadmap. Mars has abundant iron in its regolith, locked up in iron oxide minerals, rust essentially. Extracting metallic iron requires reduction processes, typically using hydrogen or carbon monoxide to strip oxygen from iron oxide at high temperatures. Mars's regolith also contains silicon, aluminum, magnesium, calcium, all the elements needed for construction materials, electronics, and industrial processes. A paper published in 2026 detailed the potential for automated mining operations using rovers and excavators to collect regolith, transport it to processing facilities, and extract useful materials. The researchers calculated that a facility processing just 1,000 metric tons of regolith per day, a relatively modest operation by Earth standards, could extract approximately 20 to 50 tons of useful metals and materials daily. To support major terraforming operations, we'd need hundreds or thousands of such facilities operating continuously. Then there's the power question. Everything we've discussed, warming the planet, splitting carbon dioxide into oxygen, running industrial facilities, requires enormous amounts of energy. Where does that energy come from? Mars receives less sunlight than Earth, but solar power is still viable, especially near the equator. Solar panels on Mars would need to be larger and more efficient than Earth equivalents to compensate for the reduced solar flux. Dust storms present a periodic challenge. During global dust storms, which occur roughly every 3 Martian years, solar power generation drops dramatically as airborne dust blocks sunlight. The massive dust storm of 2018, observed by NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and experienced by the Opportunity rover, reduced surface sunlight by over 99% at its peak. Nuclear power offers a more reliable alternative. Small modular reactors, compact fission reactors producing between 1 and 10 megawatts each, could provide continuous baseload power regardless of weather or time of day. Mars has uranium in its crust, though concentrations and accessibility are poorly known. A terraforming civilization on Mars would likely need to prospect for uranium deposits, mine them, and process nuclear fuel on site. Some researchers have proposed using fusion power, which would have enormous advantages. Deuterium can be extracted from Martian water ice, and fusion produces no long-lived radioactive waste. But fusion power remains stubbornly just beyond our technological reach, always 30 years away, as the saying goes. If we solve fusion, it transforms the energy economics of Mars terraforming. If we don't, we're reliant on solar and fission power. Let's talk about one specific industrial process that would be absolutely crucial: manufacturing super greenhouse gases. Remember those fluorinated compounds we discussed, sulfur hexafluoride perfluorocarbons, that trap heat thousands of times more effectively than carbon dioxide? These don't exist naturally on Mars. They must be manufactured. The production process requires fluorine, which doesn't exist as free element in nature, but must be extracted from fluoride minerals through electrolysis, an energy-intensive process requiring hydrofluoric acid and specialized equipment. Mars's regolith contains small amounts of fluorine in minerals like fluorapatite. Extracting, concentrating, and processing this fluorine into super greenhouse gases would require chemical plants, energy supplies, and technical expertise. One study from 2025 estimated that to warm Mars significantly using super greenhouse gases, we'd need to produce and maintain atmospheric concentrations of approximately 100 to 1,000 parts per million of these compounds. Given Mars's atmosphere mass of approximately 25 trillion kilograms, that means manufacturing between 2.5 billion and 25 billion kilograms of super greenhouse gases, and continuously replenishing them as they break down under ultraviolet radiation or settle out of the atmosphere. The production rate required would be millions of kilograms per year, sustained for centuries. This raises a fascinating parallel with Earth's current climate challenges. On Earth, we're desperately trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to prevent catastrophic warming. On Mars, we'd be deliberately maximizing greenhouse gas production to create warming. The irony isn't lost on climate scientists. In some ways, terraforming Mars could teach us techniques for managing planetary atmospheres that might eventually help us better manage Earth's climate, assuming we don't destroy our own habitability first. It's a sobering reminder that we're attempting to remake another planet when we've barely learned to be responsible stewards of our own. Here's something that captures my imagination. The first Martian cities wouldn't look like Earth cities. They'd be industrial centers first, habitats second. Picture vast solar panel arrays stretching across crater floors, their surfaces reddish with accumulated dust until cleaning robots sweep them clear. Nuclear reactors buried in hillsides for radiation shielding and protection from dust storms. Greenhouses built from Martian glass, silica extracted from regolith and melted into transparent panels. Chemical plants venting carefully designed greenhouse gases into the thin atmosphere, adding molecule by molecule to the planetary warming effort. Mines descending into ancient lava tubes, extracting minerals that formed when Mars was geologically young and active. The people living there, the first Martians, would be engineers, technicians, scientists. Their daily work would be planetary transformation, but at human scales. They'd maintain the robots, repair the equipment, troubleshoot the processes. They'd watch readouts showing atmospheric pressure increasing by thousandths of a millibar per year, temperatures rising by hundredths of a degree per decade. Progress would be measured across generations. A child born in the early terraforming era might live their entire life contributing to the project and die without ever breathing Martian air without a mask. but their grandchildren might walk in enclosed valleys where engineered mosses grow on rocks warmed by orbital mirrors. Their great-great-grandchildren might see the first clouds of a developing water cycle. This intergenerational commitment is perhaps the most challenging aspect of terraforming. Not the engineering, not the physics, not even the cost, but the sustained dedication across lifetimes. Human civilizations struggle with planning beyond election cycles or quarterly earnings reports. How do we organize societies to work toward goals that won't be realized for centuries? What institutions, what cultural values, what stories and myths would bind people together across generations in service of a planetary vision they'll never personally see completed? I think about the great cathedral builders of medieval Europe, projects that took centuries, where stonemasons worked on buildings they'd never see finished, knowing that their children and grandchildren would continue the work. There's something profoundly human in that kind of dedication, a triumph of hope and imagination over the limits of individual lifetimes. Terraforming Mars would require that same spirit, magnified 1,000-fold. It would require us to become a civilization that thinks in centuries and millennia, that plants trees under whose shade we'll never sit. And here's where it gets really interesting from a cosmic perspective. If humanity successfully terraforms Mars, we'll have demonstrated something remarkable, that intelligence, consciousness, and technology can reshape planetary environments intentionally. Earth's biosphere accidentally transformed our atmosphere over billions of years through evolution and metabolism. We'd be doing something similar deliberately, with foresight on a compressed timescale. That's a fundamentally new phenomenon in the universe, at least in our corner of it, and it raises profound questions about what advanced civilizations can and should do with planetary engineering capabilities. Let's dive into what might be the most fascinating and complex challenge of all, creating a functioning biosphere from scratch. Because even if we warm Mars, even if we create a breathable atmosphere, we still need to populate this new world with life. And not just any life, but a carefully designed ecological system capable of sustaining itself and supporting human civilization on a fundamentally alien world. On Earth, our biosphere evolved over 3.8 billion years through countless evolutionary experiments, extinctions, and adaptations. The result is an almost incomprehensibly complex web of interactions. Bacteria that fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, making it available for plants, fungi that form symbiotic relationships with plant roots, helping them extract nutrients from soil, decomposers that break down dead organic matter, returning nutrients to the cycle, predators that control prey populations, preventing overgrazing, pollinators that enable plant reproduction. Remove any major component from Earth's ecosystems and the whole system can collapse. Remember what happened when we drove wolves to extinction in Yellowstone. Elk populations exploded, overgrazed vegetation, changed river courses, and cascaded through the entire ecosystem until wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now imagine designing an entire planetary ecosystem from the ground up, with no evolutionary history, no established relationships, no natural balance. You're essentially playing Noah, but instead of preserving existing species, you're selecting and engineering organisms to fulfill specific ecological roles on Mars. This is the challenge of synthetic ecology, creating functional ecosystems through deliberate design rather than evolutionary accident. Let's start with the foundation, soil. Mars has regolith, broken rock, dust, and mineral particles, but it doesn't have soil. Not real soil anyway. Soil is a living system, a complex matrix of minerals, organic matter, water, air, and billions of microorganisms per gram. A single handful of healthy Earth soil contains more organisms than there are humans on Earth. Bacteria, archaea, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, all interacting in ways we're still trying to understand. Martian regolith is sterile, dead, and as we discussed earlier, contaminated with toxic perchlorates. Treating Martian soil would be one of the first biological challenges. Research from 2026 demonstrated that certain extremophile bacteria, organisms adapted to survive in harsh conditions, could potentially metabolize Martian perchlorates, converting them into oxygen and chloride ions. Imagine seeding Martian regolith with billions of these bacteria in protected greenhouses, adding water and nutrients, and watching them slowly, over months or years, transform dead regolith into something approaching living soil. Other bacteria would need to be introduced to begin nitrogen fixation, converting atmospheric nitrogen into forms plants can use. Fungi would establish decomposition cycles. Over time, layers of microbial activity would build organic content in the soil, creating the foundation for more complex life. But here's the catch. Every organism we introduce to Mars would need to be either naturally capable of surviving Martian conditions or genetically engineered to tolerate them. We're talking about organisms that can handle temperature swings from -125 degrees Celsius at the poles in winter to +20 degrees Celsius at the equator in summer. Organisms that can survive intense ultraviolet radiation, organisms that can function with low atmospheric pressure, low water availability, and soil chemistry unlike anything on Earth. This is where synthetic biology becomes crucial. Scientists have already demonstrated the ability to engineer organisms with dramatically enhanced capabilities. Research with cyanobacteria, photosynthetic bacteria that could potentially oxygenate Mars, has shown that we can insert genes from radiation-resistant organisms, making them more tolerant of UV exposure. We can modify their temperature tolerance ranges by incorporating antifreeze proteins from Antarctic fish or heat shock proteins from thermophilic bacteria that thrive near hydrothermal vents. We can engineer metabolic pathways that allow organisms to extract nutrients from Martian regolith or metabolize compounds that would be toxic to normal Earth life. One particularly exciting avenue involves engineering photosynthetic organisms to produce more than just oxygen. Plants on Earth capture about 3 to 6% of the solar energy that reaches them, converting it into chemical energy through photosynthesis. That's remarkably inefficient. Researchers are working on enhancing photosynthetic efficiency, potentially creating organisms that capture 10, 15, even 20% of incoming solar energy. More efficient photosynthesis means faster biomass production, faster oxygen generation, and faster soil development. For Mars, where every percentage point of efficiency translates to years or decades saved in terraforming timelines, this could be transformative. Let me share something that fills me with wonder: the concept of pioneer ecosystems. These would be the first deliberately designed biological communities introduced to early-stage terraformed Mars. They'd consist of perhaps a dozen to 50 carefully selected and engineered species, extremophile bacteria, hardy algae, modified lichens, engineered mosses, chosen to work together in establishing the foundations for more complex ecosystems. Each species would have specific roles. Some would fix nitrogen, some would metabolize perchlorates, some would produce oxygen, some would build organic soil content, some would capture and retain water. Research published in April 2026 examined exactly this concept, proposing a synthetic pioneer ecosystem for Mars based on Antarctic dry valley organisms, some of the most Mars-like environments on Earth. The researchers identified bacterial strains capable of surviving in permafrost, lichens that photosynthesize at temperatures below freezing, and cyanobacteria that form protective biofilms against desiccation and radiation. They proposed engineering these organisms with enhanced capabilities and deploying them in sheltered Martian locations, inside lava tubes, in deep craters beneath translucent aerogel coverings that would trap heat while transmitting light. Once these pioneer ecosystems established themselves, they'd begin modifying local environments, creating microclimates that could support more complex organisms. Imagine small patches of green spreading across Martian regolith, expanding year by year. Where lichens grow, they chemically weather rock, accelerating soil formation. Where cyanobacteria photosynthesize, oxygen concentrations rise locally. Where organic matter accumulates, water retention improves. Over decades, these biological beachheads would expand, merge, and gradually transform larger and larger areas. Then comes the question of plants, real complex plants. When could we grow trees on Mars? This is where things get really challenging, because vascular plants, plants with specialized tissues for transporting water and nutrients, have much more demanding requirements than bacteria or algae. They need actual soil with nutrient availability. They need protection from radiation. They need temperatures that allow for liquid water in their tissues. They need pollinators in many cases, or at least wind or water for reproduction. Early Martian plants would likely be extensively engineered versions of Earth's hardiest species. Alpine plants that survive high altitude, intense UV radiation, and extreme temperature swings. Arctic plants that complete their entire life cycle in brief summer windows. Desert plants with adaptations for extreme water conservation. These would be genetically modified to tolerate even harsher conditions, perhaps engineered with pigments that absorb UV radiation and convert it to useful energy rather than suffering DNA damage, or with antifreeze compounds that prevent ice crystal formation in their cells during Martian nights. There's a beautiful study from 2025 where researchers successfully grew modified Arabidopsis thaliana, a small flowering plant commonly used in research, in simulated Martian regolith amended with bacterial soil preparation. The plants survived and reproduced, demonstrating that with the right soil preparation and environmental protection, complex plants could potentially grow on Mars. The study noted that the plants were stunted and showed signs of stress, but they lived. That's proof of concept. With better engineering, with more suitable species, with improved conditions, Martian agriculture becomes feasible. But let's be clear, terraforming Mars with biological organisms is not a quick process. Even the most optimistic projections suggest centuries to millennia for biological oxygenation. A study from March 2026 calculated that photosynthetic organisms covering just 1% of Mars's surface and operating at 50% of Earth organism efficiency would take approximately 100 million years to generate a breathable atmosphere. 100 million years. That's obviously not practical, so realistic biological terraforming would need to be dramatically accelerated through industrial processes running in parallel. Perhaps factories split carbon dioxide chemically while photosynthetic organisms do the same biologically. Perhaps we engineer organisms with photosynthetic efficiency 5 or 10 times higher than anything on Earth. Perhaps we accept that biological systems will maintain and sustain the atmosphere once we create it through industrial means, but they won't create it alone. There's also the question of animal life. Do we introduce animals to Mars, and if so, which ones? Insects would be crucial for any ecosystem with flowering plants. Pollinators like bees, decomposers like beetles, soil aerators like ants. But insects are sensitive creatures with specific environmental requirements. You can't just dump bees on Mars and hope they survive. They'd need stable temperatures, adequate pressure, protection from radiation, flowering plants for food, and appropriate nesting sites. The infrastructure required to support even simple animal life is staggering. Some researchers envision a staged introduction. Microbes first, then algae and lichens, then mosses and simple plants, then complex plants, then insects and invertebrates, then potentially small vertebrates, fish in Martian lakes and rivers, amphibians in wetlands, eventually birds and mammals in enclosed biomes that gradually expand. Each stage could take decades to centuries. Its biological succession directed by intelligence, a controlled version of what happened naturally on Earth after mass extinctions when ecosystems rebuilt themselves from surviving species. Now let's bring this down to human scale and imagine what it would actually be like to live on Mars during the centuries-long terraforming process. Because all of our grand plans for planetary engineering ultimately depend on people, thousands, then millions of them, living, working, raising families, and building communities on a world that's actively being transformed around them. The first Martian settlements wouldn't be romantic outposts of exploration. They'd be industrial frontier towns, closer in spirit to mining camps during Earth's various resource rushes than to the gleaming sci-fi cities of popular imagination. Think less Star Trek, more Antarctic research stations crossed with oil platforms, crossed with semiconductor fabrication facilities. The work would be dangerous, technically demanding, and relentless. But it would also be purposeful in a way that few human endeavors have ever been. Every task, every shift, every repair and adjustment would be part of literally building a new world. Let's start with the habitats. Early Martian settlers would live in pressurized modules, probably landed from Earth initially, then gradually supplemented by structures built from Martian materials. Recent research has explored using Martian regolith mixed with polymers or sulfur as construction material, creating Marscrete that can be 3D printed into habitat shells, radiation shielding, and infrastructure. A study from 2026 demonstrated that regolith-based concrete using sulfur as a binder could achieve compressive strength comparable to Earth concrete. Using materials available directly from Martian soil with minimal processing, these habitats would need to maintain Earth normal pressure, about 1,000 millibars, and temperatures comfortable for humans, probably around 18 to 22 degrees Celsius. That means every habitat is essentially a spaceship on the ground, with life support systems that recycle air, water, and waste. Carbon dioxide scrubbers would continuously filter exhaled breath. Water recycling would be extraordinarily efficient. Every drop of urine, every exhaled breath, every shower, every cooking process would be captured and purified. On Mars, water isn't something you waste. It's a precious resource, locally scarce until terraforming progresses significantly. Food production would be largely hydroponic or aeroponic, growing plants in nutrient solutions without soil under LED lights that provide optimal spectrums for photosynthesis. This is more efficient than traditional agriculture and allows for controlled conditions. Martian greenhouses would be pressurized structures, probably buried partially underground for radiation protection and thermal stability, with transparent sections facing south to capture maximum sunlight. The low light levels on Mars, about 43% of Earth's solar intensity, would be supplemented with artificial lighting powered by nuclear or solar arrays. Let me paint you a picture of a day in the life of an early Martian settler. Let's call her Dr. Anya Okonkwo, a geochemist working on regolith processing. She wakes in her habitat module, a cylindrical space about 4 meters in diameter and 10 meters long, shared with 3 other crew members in sleeping compartments about the size of Japanese capsule hotels. Privacy is a luxury measured in curtains and headphones. The habitat maintains Earth normal gravity, not through any sci-fi artificial gravity, but simply because Mars has 38% of Earth's gravity. That's enough to walk normally, though everything feels lighter. A 50-kilogram person on Earth weighs 19 kilograms on Mars. After waking, Anya goes through morning routines that would be familiar yet strange to Earth dwellers. The shower is a carefully rationed affair. 2 minutes of water spray, then soap up with the water off, then 2 minutes of rinsing. Every liter of water is tracked. Breakfast is a mixture of hydroponic vegetables, cherry tomatoes, lettuce, herbs, and processed protein from bacterial cultures engineered to grow efficiently in bioreactors. There's no beef, no chicken, no fish. Those would require bringing and maintaining large animals, which is prohibitively expensive and space-consuming. Instead, there's lab-grown protein that approximates meat texture, flavored with herbs and spices that help you forget you're eating bacteria byproducts. Then it's time to suit up. Mars suits in the early terraforming era would be considerably more advanced than current spacesuits, but still bulky and restrictive. They'd maintain pressure, provide oxygen, regulate temperature, and shield against radiation as much as possible. Though really, time outside is time accumulating radiation exposure that settlers carefully track and limit. Modern research into mechanical counterpressure suits, tight garments that compress the body mechanically rather than using gas pressure, could make suits more flexible and easier to don, but they'd still be serious pieces of equipment requiring careful protocols. Enya cycles through the airlock, a chamber that equalizes pressure between the habitat interior and Mars exterior. On Mars, you don't just open a door and walk outside. Every exit and entry is a deliberate process. Check suit integrity, verify life support, depressurize the airlock gradually to avoid decompression injury. Open exterior hatch, step onto Mars. The exterior hatch opens to reveal the Martian landscape, rusty red regolith stretching to a horizon closer than Earth's because Mars is smaller, with a curvature more pronounced. The sky is a butterscotch color during the day, filled with suspended dust. The sun appears about 2/3 the size it does from Earth, crossing a sky where you can sometimes see Earth as a bright blue morning or evening star. Anya's workday involves operating and maintaining regolith processing equipment, giant excavators, looking like mining equipment from Earth, but modified for Martian conditions, scoop regolith and transport it to processing facilities. There, the regolith is heated in furnaces to extract water ice, sorted magnetically to separate iron-bearing minerals, and chemically treated to extract useful elements. It's hot, dusty work despite being on a cold planet. The equipment generates heat, and Martian dust is insidious, finding its way into every seal and joint. The dust is also chemically reactive and potentially toxic, so contamination protocols are strict. Equipment that's been outside doesn't come directly inside. Everything goes through decontamination, brushing, wiping, sometimes even chemical treatment to neutralize perchlorates. Throughout the day, Anya communicates with her team via radio. Communication on Mars is instant, not like the several-minute lag between Mars and Earth, but communication with Earth mission control and loved ones back home involves that maddening delay, currently about 8 minutes each way on average, varying from about 3 minutes when Mars and Earth are closest to 22 minutes when they're on opposite sides of the Sun. Conversations become asynchronous exchanges of messages rather than real-time dialogue. You leave a message, go about your work, and get a response later. Family relationships are conducted through recorded videos, letters, and carefully scheduled conversation sessions where you exchange messages back and forth across the void. After an 8 to 10 hour work shift, labor regulations matter on Mars, maybe even more than on Earth, because fatigue in a hazardous environment kills. Anya returns to the habitat through another airlock cycle. The suit comes off in stages: outer contamination zone, where dust is removed; intermediate zone, where the suit itself is inspected and stored; inner zone, where you finally step back into the habitat in regular clothes. There's dinner with crewmates, conversations about Earth news received in recent data uploads, Arguments about optimal protocols for the new water extraction system, someone practicing guitar badly, someone else absorbed in a virtual reality environment that lets them walk through forests on Earth, a precious mental health resource when you're living in metal cans on a dead planet. Evening activities might include exercise, crucial on Mars because even the 38% gravity causes muscle and bone loss over time, though less severe than in zero gravity. There's education and training because skills and knowledge are survival tools on Mars. There's limited entertainment, mostly digital, streamed from Earth or locally produced by talented settlers. There's scientific work because many settlers are researchers studying Mars itself, documenting the terraforming process, conducting experiments. And there's sleep, precious sleep, because tomorrow brings another day of building the future molecule by molecule. Now multiply Anya's experience by thousands, then tens of thousands, then eventually millions of people over centuries. Imagine settlements growing from clusters of modules to sprawling underground complexes to surface cities protected by domes and pressure walls. Imagine the gradual cultural evolution as Earth transplants give way to Mars-born generations who've never experienced Earth's blue sky, heavy gravity, or abundant open atmosphere. These Martians would think differently, see themselves differently. Mars would be home, not a frontier. Earth would be the exotic alien place, the heavy gravity world of their ancestors. If you are still watching, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. These videos take tremendous research and effort to bring you the most accurate and up-to-date scientific information. There's fascinating research on how low gravity affects human development. Children born on Mars would grow taller than Earth humans. Bones and spine would elongate in the reduced gravity. Their cardiovascular systems would adapt to lower gravity, potentially making them unable to ever visit Earth without serious health risks from the crushing 1G environment. Within a few generations, Mars-born humans might be a distinct population, adapted to their environment in ways that make them fundamentally Martian. And think about governance and social organization. Who makes decisions on Mars? Early settlements would probably operate under corporate or governmental frameworks from Earth, NASA, SpaceX, ESA, CNSA, or multinational consortiums, but as settlements grow and become self-sufficient, wouldn't they demand autonomy? The American Revolution happened partly because of the geographic distance and communication lag between colonies and the British Crown. Mars has a communication lag orders of magnitude worse, and a distance that makes political control from Earth essentially impossible. Martian independence seems almost inevitable, probably within a century or two of serious colonization. What kind of society would emerge? That's one of the most fascinating questions. Some envision technocratic societies where scientists and engineers hold primary decision-making authority. After all, survival on Mars depends absolutely on technical competence. Others imagine more democratic frameworks where all settlers have voice in collective decisions. Still others worry about corporate control, leading to neo-feudal arrangements where settlers are essentially indentured to the companies that transported them. The social and political evolution of Martian civilization would be one of the great experiments in human organization, comparable to the founding of any nation on Earth, but occurring in an environment where mistakes can be instantly lethal. Now we need to confront the elephant in the room, or perhaps more accurately, the trillion-dollar question hanging over the entire terraforming enterprise. Will we actually do this? Can we afford it? How long would it really take? And perhaps most importantly, should we? Let's start with the brutal economics. Every estimate of terraforming costs is speculative because we're talking about an unprecedented project with no historical comparison, but we can make educated guesses based on component costs. The most optimistic estimates suggest a total investment on the order of $10 to $50 trillion spread over several centuries. The more pessimistic estimates reach into the hundreds of trillions or even quadrillions of dollars. To put that in perspective, global GDP in 2026 is approximately $100 trillion per year. We're talking about an investment potentially equivalent to multiple years of total human economic output. But here's where it gets interesting. That cost wouldn't come all at once. It would be distributed across centuries, with different phases requiring different investment levels. A comprehensive analysis published in January 2026 broke down terraforming into economic phases, establishing the first permanent settlements, mining operations, manufacturing capabilities, and basic life support. Estimated cost, $5 to $10 trillion. This is the most expensive phase relative to benefits because you're building everything from scratch with minimal local resources. Every kilogram of equipment comes from Earth at enormous cost. This phase is about creating the foundation for everything that follows, scaling up mining, manufacturing, and energy production to the point where Mars can produce most of what it needs locally. Begin atmospheric modification through super greenhouse gas production and orbital mirror deployment. Estimated cost, $20 to $50 trillion. This phase sees costs per unit of output dropping dramatically as local manufacturing comes online. Instead of launching everything from Earth, you're increasingly using Martian resources, large-scale atmospheric modification, temperature increase, biological introduction, water release from subsurface ice. This is where visible planetary changes begin. Estimated cost, $50 to $100 trillion. Paradoxically, this phase might see lower annual costs than Phase 2 because Mars is now largely self-sufficient, with its own industrial base covering operational expenses. The cost is high because the phase is long and involves massive continuous operations, ecosystem establishment, atmospheric oxygenation through biological and industrial means, gradual expansion of habitable zones. Estimated cost, difficult to calculate because by this point Mars should have a functioning economy that funds its own development. External investment from Earth might be minimal or unnecessary. Looking at these timelines and costs, a pattern emerges. The economic model isn't a simple expenditure where Earth pays to terraform Mars as some kind of planetary charity project. Instead, it's an investment in creating a second economic sphere that gradually becomes self-sustaining and eventually contributes to the larger human economy. Mars would have resources, industries, and capabilities that benefit the entire solar system economy, mining operations, manufacturing facilities using low gravity and abundant solar power, research stations, and eventually agricultural production. Some economists argue that Mars doesn't need to be terraformed to be economically valuable. A partially terraformed Mars with industrial facilities, settlements, and resource extraction could generate returns long before the planet becomes Earth-like. In fact, there's an argument that full terraforming might never make pure economic sense. Why spend the last $100 trillion to make the atmosphere fully breathable when you could just keep living in pressurized habitats with a thicker, warmer atmosphere outside that makes those habitats simpler and safer? This raises a crucial concept: partial terraforming. Instead of pushing all the way to an Earth-like environment, we might create what researchers call a shirt-sleeve Mars, our planet, where the atmospheric pressure and temperature allow humans to walk outside wearing just oxygen masks and warm clothing without pressure suits. Imagine Mars with an atmospheric pressure of 300 to 500 millibars, not breathable, but thick enough that you don't need a full spacesuit. Temperature ranges that hover around freezing to 20 degrees Celsius in habitable zones. This would be vastly easier and cheaper than full terraforming achievable in centuries rather than millennia, and might represent a practical endpoint rather than a stepping stone. Now let's talk timeline in more detail, because this is where speculation meets sobering reality. Every serious analysis concludes that terraforming is a multi-century to millennial project. There's simply no way around the scale of what we're attempting. Let me share a detailed timeline synthesis from recent research. Robotic missions characterize resources in detail. First human landing missions establish temporary bases. Begin developing in situ resource utilization, extracting water from ice, producing fuel from atmospheric CO2, manufacturing building materials from regolith. Population, dozens to low hundreds of people in rotating crews, transition from temporary bases to permanent settlements. Establish industrial infrastructure capable of supporting thousands of people. Begin serious discussions about terraforming, planning, technology development, initial small-scale experiments. Population, thousands, major expansion of mining, manufacturing and energy production. Mars becomes largely self-sufficient for basic needs. First serious terraforming interventions, deploying orbital mirrors, beginning super greenhouse gas production, triggering regolith warming experiments. Population, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, sustained, large-scale atmospheric modification, mean temperature increases by 10 to 20 degrees Celsius. Atmospheric pressure doubles or triples from baseline. Sublimation of polar CO2 creates a positive feedback loop. First biological experiments in protected zones. Population, millions. Introduction of progressively complex organisms. Pioneer ecosystems establish in favorable locations. Oxygen production begins through photosynthesis, supplemented by industrial processes. Atmospheric pressure reaches 100 to 200 millibars. Temperature in equatorial regions sometimes exceeds freezing. Population, tens of millions. Expansion of biologically active zones. Gradual oxygenation continues. Atmosphere reaches 300 to 500 millibars with small but increasing oxygen percentage. Temperature continues warming. Some regions might support liquid water during summer. Humans can walk outside in warm gear with oxygen masks in favorable locations. Population, potentially hundreds of millions. Looking at that timeline, something becomes clear. Nobody alive today will see a terraformed Mars. Neither will your children or your grandchildren, or probably many generations beyond that. This is a project for civilization, not for individuals. The emotional and psychological challenge of committing to something so far beyond personal timescales is immense. Which brings us to the most profound question: why would we do this? What drives a civilization to undertake a project whose completion is centuries in the future, whose costs are astronomical, whose benefits accrue primarily to descendants not yet born? There are practical arguments: existential risk mitigation. If Earth suffers a catastrophic asteroid impact, supervolcanic eruption, nuclear war, pandemic, or runaway climate change, having a self-sustaining human population on Mars ensures species survival. This is the Bedtime drive for humanity argument. Some find it compelling. Others note that it would be vastly cheaper and easier to prevent Earth catastrophes than to terraform Mars as insurance against them. There are resource arguments. Mars has raw materials, metals, minerals, water ice that could support space-based industries and reduce dependence on Earth's limited resources. But again, asteroids and the Moon offer many of the same resources with easier access and less gravity to overcome. There are scientific arguments. Mars exploration teaches us about planetary evolution, astrobiology, climate science, geology, and countless other fields. Terraforming would be the ultimate applied planetary science project, testing our understanding of atmospheric physics, ecology, and geochemistry. But you can do science without terraforming. Robotic missions and small research bases could answer most questions. No, I think the real reasons are deeper and less rational, or perhaps more profoundly rational, in ways that pure cost-benefit analysis can't capture. We might terraform Mars because humans are a species that explores, that pushes boundaries, that asks, what if, and then tries to make it real. Because the idea of making a dead planet live again, of spreading the biosphere beyond its cradle, of ensuring that life and consciousness persist even if Earth fails. These ideas resonate with something fundamental in human nature. There's also the simple wonder of it. Imagine standing on a hillside on Mars in the year 2800, watching genetically engineered grasses sway in a thin but real wind, looking up at a sky that's gone from butterscotch to pale blue-pink, feeling warmth from a sun that shines through an atmosphere, humans built molecule by molecule. That moment, that triumph, would represent one of the greatest achievements of intelligence in the universe, at least as far as we know. Maybe that's enough reason.